Hi, welcome to an introduction to logic. My name is Mark Thorsby, and this course overviews some of the basics of formal and elements of informal logic. We're using A Concise Introduction to Logic by Patrick Hurley. So welcome everyone, I hope you're doing well. In today's segment, we're going to be looking at some of the problems regarding language, meaning, and definition. And in particular, we're going to be focusing on the intention and the extension of terms. Okay, so welcome everyone. I hope you guys are doing well, and I hope that you're enjoying logic so far in the semester. So today we're talking about the intention and the extension of terms. And before I jump into today's lesson, I wanted to begin by saying a little bit about one of my favorite philosophers, who is a logician, but he's probably one of the most influential, if not the most influential philosopher of the 20th century. His name is Ludwig Wittgenstein. Here's one of his books called Philosophical Grammar. But he has a number of different books. His principal text is the Philosophical Investigations, or the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. So, and I want to sort of start off with a little bit about Wittgenstein here, because Wittgenstein is one of these philosophers who's intensely interested in understanding what exactly is going on when we use our language, because we do a lot with our language. In fact, we do a lot more with our language than logic would make us think. That is, when we use language, we're communicating a whole series of things that can't be captured by pure arguments. In fact, probably very little of what we do in human language actually counts towards fully fleshed out cognitive arguments. Probably most of what we spend our time doing is trying to persuade each other, making emotive sorts of statements, describing certain states of affairs, and so on and so forth. None of that is necessarily argumentative in nature. So that means that language is much larger than logic, or that is, there's a certain logic to our language, but not everything we do in language is necessarily fits well into a logical analysis or a logical schema of some form or another, right? So that's sort of an important sort of thing. So when we talk about, because one of the key elements in this section this week here is really emphasizing or talking about the role of language in terms of, well, because ultimately the sort of language we use is often which can easily trip us up in terms of evaluating arguments. So we're going to spend a lot of time in this course really focusing on developing the capacity to clearly articulate what's being argued within a discourse of some sort or another, right? So, but Ludwig Wittgenstein, here, I'll write his name down here for you. Wittgenstein, he writes two different books. The first book he writes is the Tractatus. And Wittgenstein thought this, at least at the time when he wrote the Tractatus, is that if all of the philosophical problems we have come in the form of language, and language has a certain a priori structure, if you will, I use that term loosely, but if language has a certain sort of structure, then the task could be, if we can understand the structure of language, we will be able to understand the structure for the types of problems we deal with in philosophy. In fact, Wittgenstein believed that, at least in his early years, that by articulating the internal structure, logical structure of language, you could really solve a whole range, if not all, of the philosophical problems that philosophers deal with. And this is his view, and it's a very sort of, I guess, homogenizing view, because he thinks he can give an account for the essence of language as such. But by his later years, right, and Wittgenstein originally wrote the Tractatus partially while he was at Cambridge, the other part while he was on the front lines of World War I, and also when he lived in Norway. But it was actually published when he was in a prisoner of war camp in Italy, actually. So, but the Tractatus, after the publication of the Tractatus, a number of questions began to emerge about whether or not one really could give a systematic and complete account for the logic of language. And Wittgenstein himself, because of another gentleman by the name of Frank Ramsey, he was convinced that his original theory in the Tractatus was wrong. And so in his later years, he began to think about the logic of language in a very different sense. And he's well known for instance, at one point in the second part of the philosophical investigations, his later work, Wittgenstein says that language is like an ancient city with lots of different streets and avenues built up at certain times. He also develops the notion of what we call a language game. And in his previous theory in the Tractatus was the idea that all of language, assuming, right, this is all of language, the all of language follows a very systematic, uniform structure that would govern the entire body of linguistic utterance. By the time you get to Wittgenstein's later work, he's given up this idea of a sort of unitary, monolithic, logical structure. Instead, he starts to view language as something like a game, where we communicate with each other, and there's certain rules that govern that communication, but those rules are ultimately based upon the certain sorts of practices in our life world, right? And so the previous view of Wittgenstein's was the idea that all language had to fall under a certain rubric of laws. He changes this and says, no, every language reveals that there are particular language games, right? And that they change in different settings, and that they are ultimately based upon practices or life forms. So, for instance, to take a good example here is take. So I'm trying to think of a good example off the top of my head. Think of, for instance, when someone uses the word happy, right? The word happy has different meanings in different contexts, right? So, for instance, if I see you on the corner of the street and I say, "How was your weekend?" and you say, "I had a happy weekend," that means one thing in the sense that I essentially know that you're referring to the idea of having a time off, and there's certain sorts of domains in which that word applies. But if you change the context, that is, if you change the practice, then that changes the logical structure of the term. It changes the game. So, for instance, imagine if you're doing, let's see, if someone says you're happy-go-lucky, right? There, the word happy means something different than it did in the case where you said I had a happy weekend, right? So you can see how words change based upon the practices in which they arise. And that was Wittgenstein's view, but what does that mean ultimately? It meant that you couldn't solve all of philosophy's problems ahead of time by just working out the logic, because the logic is ultimately based upon a certain existential criteria. That is how we live our life. Now, why am I going on and on and on about this? Because ultimately, one of the tasks we have in logic is to evaluate arguments, but in order to evaluate arguments, we have to first become clear about what is actually being claimed. And that's where it's helpful to keep in mind that our words can have different rules. Our words sort of fall under different rules based upon the practices we employ. That's why one of the things that's interesting is that we really need context if we're going to understand what people mean when they make claims. We really ultimately need to have a context with which they're arguing or debating or thinking about a specific topic, because context reveals the practice, right? Let's put it like this. The context will reveal the practice, and the practice ultimately determines the logic of the word, okay? So that's very important. So now that I've said all of that, let's sort of step back a moment and think about some of the problems that we have when we try to understand what people make in arguments. The first here is what we'll just call the problem of ambiguity. Sorry, my handwriting's a little tight. It's a little hard to write on this. The problem of ambiguity. Now, we'll ultimately define ambiguity in a very specific way in a little bit later. But we can say that what is ambiguity? A statement is ambiguous if it can mean more than one thing, essentially, right? If you're not sure what a statement means, it's ambiguous. It's ambiguous in terms of whether or not it's referring to one thing or referring to another thing. So the problem of ambiguity ultimately requires us to develop what we call our definitions. Now, in our next video, we're going to talk a lot about definitions and different types of definitions. But we can see that definitions become a critical feature of understanding what people mean, right? Or, if you will, in the Wittgensteinian sense, understanding what practices a linguistics utterance applies, right? So what is a definition, though? We're used to thinking of definitions as those things we look up in Webster's, right? Well, it's interesting here. I think it's helpful to think about the etymology of the term. The etymology is the root word history. Now, ultimately, this is composed of two different words in Latin. The first is de, which means something like concerning or reason by or from, or it means it's sort of, that's generally what de means in Latin. And finis is where we get definition, right? Now, finis in Latin means something like the limit. So what is a definition? Literally, it means by reason of the limit. And I think that's very interesting, right? By reason of the limit. Because what a definition does is it actually demarcates a boundary zone in terms of how a specific word or concept or term applies within a linguistic setting, right? So a definition, what the definition ultimately does is a definition signals the limit of the concept, how far and under what and to what extent the concept applies, and in what manner that concept applies. So a definition ultimately means something like putting out what the limit of the concept is. And ultimately what we're going to be talking about today, which is the intention and the extension of terms, we're going to be referring here to basically the way in which these boundaries get demarcated and what exactly they do. Now, I want to make a distinction here. Words versus terms. What we're going to talk about today is that in logic, we evaluate the terms of an argument. We don't evaluate the words. Right? The words literally just refer to the grammatical sentences, the units within a sentence, right? Or a statement. We're not studying words, right? So let's clarify that. This is not what we're studying. What we're studying are terms. And what is a term? Well, think of a term essentially as a category, right? And so lots and lots of different things can be terms, right? So for instance, if I say flowers, that can be a term because it can be a whole category of things. So you'll notice here that terms, since they're categories, we'd have to understand a category in two ways, right? To really understand what a category is, you have to understand what counts for something to be in the category, right? What counts for the category, and then also who is in the category. Those are the sort of kind of two things that have to get identified when we talk about terms or categories. And basically what we're talking about here is the intention and the extension of a term. So, but let me say this, the last thing I'll say about a term is that you can say a term is just simply defined as a subject, a subject of a statement. It's very sort of simple, bare bones definition. So it's just the subject of a sentence, right? Now the subject can be a category, so it's not just the word, right? It's similar to the distinction I make in this course between a proposition and a statement. A proposition refers to the meaningful content of a claim, whereas a statement refers to the words or the language used to make it, right? Okay, and by the way, here, one of the things we can say here is that what's not a term? We'll call this non-terms, because there's lots of different things that are not terms. For instance, let's put a dot here, verbs, like swim is not a term, that's a verb, that's an action term, if you will. Adjectives, or at least what we might say is non-substantive adjectives, right? So for instance, if I say, the grass is green. Green is not a term, right? Green is an adjective in that case, right? Now, when we say non-substantive, we can say, well, green could be a substantive category, things that are called green, but just referring but just making a non-substantive adjective claim is not, we're not going to count that as a term. We've got adverbs in here. Let's see what else we got. We got prepositions. And I'll sort of show you from the book here some of the other things like conjunctions. A conjunction is when you say, for instance, and. The word and is a conjunction. So you said, I'm having a good day and I met Johnny today, right? I've conjoined those two things together, so that's what a conjunction is. But a conjunction itself is not a term. And then we can have just the arrangement of words. So we'll just put a non-syntactic arrangement of words. Okay, that's not a term either, right? So let me give you here an example. Let me actually pull up the book here so you can see what I mean, for instance. So here's an example of these are not terms. Dictatorial, runs quickly. Let me make it bigger for you. Runs quickly, activity, or no, I'm sorry. Runs quickly, above and beyond. Moreover, craves, cabbages into again, the forest, therefore, since. All of those things are not terms, right? There are ways that help us sort of understand the terms. Now, what we're going to see here is what we call it, I'll just show you here, is the intension versus the extension of a term. Every term has two different things. As you can see from the little graphic here, if we take the term inventor, it has an intention, it has an extension. The intention refers to the attributes that are characteristic of that term or of that category, right? Think that the attributes refer to what makes that thing, right? What are the attributes that make that term what it is? Whereas by contrast, the extension or the denotation refers to the class members. That is, so if we take example of inventor, an inventor would include cleverness, intuitiveness, creativeness, imaginativeness, and so on and so forth. That's what an inventor connotates, right? Those are the attributes that it connotates. But by contrast, it denotates or it extends to specific class members like Thomas Edison, Alexander Graham Bell, Samuel Morse, the Wright brothers, Steve Jobs, etc., right? So when we talk about intension versus extension, we're talking about the way in which we can refer to or distinguish categorical terms from each other. Okay, so let me see. Let me show you. This is the. So let's just go back here. So what are we going to say here? When we talk about the intention, we're thinking here about the attributes of the term. When we talk about the extension, we're talking about the class members. Right, so let's take an example of a categorical term. Let's take the category of books, right? So what would the intention of books be? The intention of books would include things like written text, typographical, things like that, right? Where letters, syntax is an attribute of a book, is a certain sort of syntactic structure, something like that. The extension refers to specific examples or class members. So we could say that crime and punishment is an extension of the concept of books. Reading is an intentional element to the concept of books, right? Because all books have to be read, whereas it's not a class member. A class member would be just an example, a different type of book, right? Let's say The Death of Ivan Ilyich, right? There's a class member of books, right? So and by the way, when we talk about intention, this is the language whenever one says to connotate. Make sure I got this right, yeah. So we got connotation over here, but the extension is what we call the denotation. You've probably heard of the term connotate and denotate, and perhaps you weren't clear on what the difference is, but now you know. Okay. Now, there's something that's interesting worth mentioning, and your book mentions it, and I think it's fairly interesting philosophically, is the idea that there's essentially there's different ways, different philosophical concepts, or there's a debate in logic about how a term connotates, right? So let's go back to connotation. Oops, sorry. Oops. Oh well. Sorry about that spelling, Kufa. Okay, so you have connotation. Now the question is, what does it mean to connotate something? That is, for instance, if I take the word book, right, and I connotate the concept of typographic, right, having letters and stuff like that. Now it raises the question of, am I identifying what the categorical term necessarily requires, or am I just reporting what I think it requires, right? And this is known as the difference or the debate between the subjectivity and the objectivity of connotation. Now, one view is what we call objective connotation. The idea of objective connotation is the idea that one determines what the connotation refers to those things which are essential attributes for that thing, without which it couldn't be the concept in question, right? Whereas the other view here is the idea of what we call subjective connotation. And subjective connotation is the idea that when you do a connotation, you're not giving the essential attributes as you are in the objective. Well, instead what you're giving is you're giving the attributes insofar as I'll put I understand them. Right? So the objective refers to the essential attributes that you absolutely have to have for that category to get off the ground. Right? And people who would agree with this, like ancient person like Plato, he would be an objective connotation person. But the subjective view tends to be a much more modern view, which basically says, I can't know what's really in your head, and I can't even know objectively what makes a book, but we do know in our minds what we think we mean. And so we have a notion of subjective connotation. Now, we won't get into the question of linguistic epistemology and all this other stuff, but we'll just simply say it raises a very interesting question for us in this class, which is namely that, is logic, if it's a science as such, does logic ultimately investigate these essential attributes, or is logic in the business of investigating how people perceive these attributes within their own minds? That is logic ultimately based upon certain psychological criteria? Now, this is a huge question in the philosophy of logic, and I probably haven't even phrased it well, but it's a very interesting and important question. Another thing that's sort of interesting is to think when we talk about denotation, for instance, is that the denotation of terms can change, right? So, for instance, take the term the current King of France, right? And so hopefully everyone who's watching this knows that there is no King of France currently. There used to be a long time ago. So now think about it. If you use this phrase in the 12th century, then the denotation, it would denote an existing, it would denote, the certain kings or whatever of France who were living, and this would have meaning. Today, because there is no current King of France, what we say is that this term has what we say is an empty denotation. I'm sorry, an empty extension. It's empty because there is no current King of France, right? But it does refer. So you can say that we can know what the current King of France means, and we know it because we can connotate what kingliness is, right? Being a king is being some sort of figurehead within a monarchical system, etc., etc. So we can understand what the term means, but when it comes to the denotation, what we discover is an empty extension, because The extension doesn't refer to anything because there is no King of France. This is an important point because this really begins to clarify why it is we can talk about things that don't exist, like unicorns, for instance. Um, Unicorns have an empty extension. So we know what a unicorn is, but we don't know that a unicorn is. And that's sort of the distinction we're seeing when we talk about the difference between the intension and the extension of terms. Now we're almost done here with the video. I just want to sort of say a couple last things. And this is a really sort of important thing, so I'll sort of start here. And this is the idea that intention determines extension. This is what sometimes referred to here as logical priority. That is, intention has logical priority over extension. Why? Because what something is determines how we determine, only by knowing what something is can we determine who counts as a member of that class somethingness, right? So there's two types of relationship. There's two types of relation between intention and extension, but intention is more fundamental. It's logically prior because it determines the extension. So it's sort of interesting, and people have written on this, but you can have an empty extension. Can you have an empty intention? Perhaps. It'd be sort of an interesting case in language, right? But it'd be hard to understand what that would mean. So we won't get into it, but intention determines extension. You can have an empty extension, but an empty intention, I'm not so sure about, but that's something we can think about. I'm curious to hear, maybe you can put in the comments what you think. The very last thing we're going to mention here before we look at some of the homework problems is talk about the idea is that when people give definitions or they begin to define what they mean by something, especially when they give extensions and they discuss the extension of something, you can have what we call as increasing. Here we're going to do this, increasing and decreasing. We're going to make a table. And then we can have intention and extension. Right, so this is extension. Now, what is increasing? Let's start with the extension. That's the easier one. What's increasing extension? Increasing extension it basically concerns the specificity with the way in which one discusses the relationships or the who counts as a member class. So, for instance, if I go animal, mammal, feline, tiger, there I have actually an increasing extension because I'm increasingly specifying who the member classes are. But I can also, if I reverse that, swap that around, I went tiger, feline, mammal, animal, right? There I have decreasing extension because I'm actually, if you will, widening the scope of what I mean I'm widening the category in terms of who counts as a member of that category. So that's what increasing and decreasing extension refers to. Increasing and decreasing intention refers to essentially the same idea, which is daily the increasing specificity of the attributes or the decreasing specificity of the attributes, okay? So that's all increasing and decreasing extension and intention is. Now let's take a look here at the homework exercises so you can see some of the examples. By the way, let's see here. Do they give an example, a good example of? No, the examples are somehow missing. Okay. So let's hear the following exercises. Here's what you have to do for the homework exercises. Section 1 is determine which of the following words or groups of words are terms and which are non-terms. So extortion, laborious, cunningly, annoy, right? Annoy for sure is not a category. It's not a term. Empire State Building, that could be a term, right? Any sort of noun is ultimately probably a term. Thomas Jefferson is a term. No, wake up, that's not a term, right? Graceful dancer, this could be a term. So I won't do them all, but you can sort of see how it works. Is it a term or not? The second thing you're going to do is names the attributes that are connotated by the following terms. So let's take riot. What's a connotation of a riot? You can imagine mayhem is a connotation of a riot, right? So it's something like that. In the following here, you have to do denotation. Now remember, denotation is an example of a member class. So a denotation of a newspaper, for instance, would be the New York Times, right? A denotation of a scientist could be Albert Einstein, right? And then what you're going to do is you're going to put the following order of increasing intention, right? So conifer, Sitka spruce, tree, spruce, plant. So you have basically a plant. So if it's an increasing intention, then that means the specificity should increase. So Sitka spruce should be the last one, right? There are lots of different types of trees. Some of them are conifers. There's some are plants. So this one would probably be plant, tree, conifer, spruce, Sitka spruce. Right, let's see if that's what they did. Yep, that's exactly what they did. So that's increasing. And then they'll ask you to do decreasing. And then they got some true-false questions. It's pretty easy, this homework exercise. But you can see this is the intension and the extension of terms. Thank you guys for watching this video. I hope this helps and gives you some insight into thinking about some of the different things that our language does. And as you go forward, in your normal day, and you hear people making arguments and making claims, ask yourself, test yourself, practice. Say, what was the connotation of that? What's the denotation of that? And become accustomed to using that language. Okay? Thank you very much for watching online. I'll see you guys later.